Hello, folks. I have a bit of a timely message for you guys today, and that's probably this time of year has been what's provoked the message I'm about ready to give you guys. I would like to thank my wifey for helping me to set this up today, and a shout out to my wife. Today is her birthday, and today is July the 11th. And for me, it seems that there's always just something about this time of year that I don't know, works for me. I have people this time of year. I've had several people in my life this time of year that have been that have been born this time of year that have been very important to me over the years, and being if I might do a bit of astrology, I'm trying to get kind of warmed up to preach here a little bit, but this is all going to be included. But being a Capricorn in astrology, Cancer, we're in the month of Cancer here. Cancer is my opposite, and your opposites in astrology are always people who have you have good communication with and through. And so Cancers in my life have always been the people that I have. How it works is you have, with the 12 signs, say if you're a Virgo, then you communicate directly well. The dead due straight opposite of you is Pisces, and this is why that a little bit of relationship advice here. But these are the people that, if you're looking for relationships, that will generally always work out good, if not the best for you, is to find your opposite. And I have found this to be the case in my life. But you have direct lines of communication, like Capricorn and Cancer are at the bottom and the top. So I have good direct communication with Cancers. Now, like for example, if you're up here and you're trying to talk to somebody that's like over here, then you've got to go like this way and this way to get to them. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have good communication with them to some degree, but it's not straight direct communication. So, and anyway, it seems to me that this time of year, for some reason, that I can just communicate with the world maybe better, you know? I remember a sermon that I preached one time, and this time of year, and it just seemed to be that I could put it out easily. It's just this time of year, something to do with this time of year. I can just, I don't know if that's what it is or what, but anyway, and so I would like to preach a message basically about this time of year and what we've just been through, as in Independence Day, American Independence Day. American Independence Day, for those of you who don't know, is on the 4th of July. And so that has been what has kind of thought-provoked this message. And I know no better way than to tell you this. I might not be the best at just putting it out, but hopefully today I will be. Hopefully this time of year will give me some sort of an advantage over other times of the year, if what I'm thinking is not crazy. So I feel like an Old Testament prophet. I want to just, you can imagine that they knew stuff. They knew so much, and they wanted to try to help people, and they had foresight of what was going to happen. They realized what was going on around them. They had foresight of things that were going to happen, and whenever they talked to people, they wanted to just beseech them. I beseech you, please listen to what I'm getting ready to tell you. Please have a little bit of long suffering, and because it's probably going to take me a little while to get this out, but this is very important. This will clear up and help people to understand what's going on in the message world as a whole so much. If you can listen to me today, if you can get past the my perhaps lack of professional style speaking. If you can get past that, and if you can bear with me and my slow approach, because I'm not fast, I'm going to be slow. And I beseech you, please listen to me. I'm like an Old Testament prophet. I'm crying from the mountaintops, and I'm saying, please listen to me. Listen to what I have to say. It is very important. It's the most important thing that you can do right now will be to listen to this. And yeah, I could go a couple different ways from here. It's like this. I think people are glossing over, and I know not a lot of people have listened to the things that I've had to say, but this has seemed to be true throughout all of history. It seems like people gloss over a very important fact here and there. Like I have been saying for the longest time, and this is not my sermon, but I want to make a point here before I get started into it. To me, it's like people gloss over important details. My wife once asked me, she said, what is the message now? Because, I've been saying all this stuff, and I've been saying that there's a message basically beyond the third coming and love divine stuff. And she said, well, what is the message now? And I said, the message is simply to understand that both sides of message and the third coming and whatever that side, neither one's any good. Or essentially, well, I'm going to explain that more in detail, but it's basically simply to understand that neither one's really any good to some degree, and to some varying degrees. But that's kind of a broad brush way of putting it. But what was William Branham's message? Yeah, sure, you had all the prophet stuff and all this and that and the seventh church age ministry. Okay, yeah, right. But really, truly, in my opinion, the message, the most important thing of William Branham's message was simply to understand, he got everybody to understand that the Baptists and the Pentecostals were, to varying degrees, no good. Neither one was any good. That was the message. If you had that, then that was definitely what opened the door to the rest of it, to be able to understand that he was a prophet and everything else. But you had to understand that. That was the key. That was, to me, that's the absolute most important thing. That's almost even more important than understanding that he was a prophet, really. But the key was to understand that Baptists were no good and Pentecostals were no good. Because everybody, the Pentecostals had concluded that, well, the Baptists were no good, right? And so everybody at that point was a Pentecostal, basically. And so anyway, William Branham came along and said, yeah, well, witch doctors can speak in tongues too. So speaking in tongues is not necessarily, because the whole Pentecostal movement was basically just based on speaking in tongues. Okay, so he got him to understand. He said, yeah, and that's not by itself, if you just look at it that way, it's not any good either, And so then once somebody understood that was the case, then that was what made it to where they could start to listen to William Branham, really. And they could start to understand who he was and this and that, because they had to get out of their Pentecostalism first. They had to get out of the notion that speaking in tongues was not evidence of the Holy Ghost. Okay, that was basically what it was. That's the great revelation that William Branham gave to that age, in my opinion, is that very singular thing. And because that's what propelled them out of all the Pentecostalism that they were in. Okay, so I have been saying that, and I'm pleading with you, I'm beseeching you, listen, and don't gloss over this. They glossed over that. People would have glossed over that and said, oh, okay, but that's what it was. That was William Branham saying, neither side's any good. We thought the Pentecostals were good, and they weren't really any good either. So so that's why I'm saying here is that I'm telling you that the third coming, love, divine side, whatever, the whole lump, the idea has basically been, the main idea has basically, or the main opposed idea has basically been that they believe that you have to understand William Branham's message in a new light, and then you have understanding. Or you have to speak William Branham's message in a new tongue, or a new tongue of understanding, so to speak, and then you have understanding, or the modern version of the Holy Ghost. Okay? Well, I'm here to tell you that that's no good either. That is not evidence. Speaking, if you can understand William Branham's message in a new light, or a new understanding, that is not evidence, that is not necessarily evidence that you have understanding. That is not necessarily evidence that you have the modern Holy Ghost. And thereby, I'm essentially saying that neither side's really any good, relatively speaking. The message was not any good, and the Don Parnell side is not any good. That's what I'm telling you. Okay? If you all can understand that, then that is the most important thing that I will probably ever be able to tell you in my life. And from there, you can begin to understand about things like all the other things that went on in William Branham's message. You can understand. You can begin to understand where you're at, what you're doing, what everybody's doing, who's who, this and that. Okay, who's who of the age, whatever. Okay, so, but you can't gloss over that. You can't just well, okay, that's not just a well, okay. That's important. That's the most important thing. Is you need to understand that is not evidence of understanding. Being able to understand William Branham's message in a new light is not evidence of understanding. You need to go beyond all this message, Pentecostal equivalence of all this Don Parnell side over here, and you need to be able to step beyond that. You can't just gloss over that. I beseech you, people. I beseech you like an Old Testament prophet. You can't do it. You can't just stay there. You have to, I'm telling you, you have to come higher. You have to come higher than going higher. That's what you have to do, because that message was all about going higher. Okay, well, I'm telling you, you have to go higher than going higher, essentially. You have to go higher than a message of going higher, is basically what I'm telling you. So, among other things. Okay, so I wanted to let you all know that you can't just gloss over that. That is it. If I speak to people and they just, I tell them that, and I'm like, this is it. This is what I hope they get. If they get nothing from what I'm saying, I hope they get this. And that's got to be the thing. That was the thing that William Branham told him, and that was what the thing that said, oh, okay, so we can go beyond Pentecostalism. And this is the thing I'm telling you that says, oh, that's the trigger. We can go beyond Don Parnellism. The Don Parnellism equivalence of the message Pentecostalism. We can go beyond message Pentecostalism. That's the main thing. The main thing. Okay, so anyway, it's important. I beseech you. Okay, so one day if they write the book of Brother Cook, and it's like, the equivalence of who do you think you are, right? But anyway, if that, one day, 2,000 years from now, if somebody's ever reading Brother Cook, if they go back and see these sermons, then that's going to be like the line in Isaiah or Jeremiah or something where he's trying to plead with the Israelites to be like, I'm trying to help you. That's what it's going to be. That's what it's going to be. They're going to look back on this and they're going to be like, that was Brother Cook trying to tell those crazy people of that age to wake up. That's what it's going to be. Because that's what we would look back. We would read Isaiah and Jeremiah, and we look at it now. It's so plain and simple, because we got the whole story. We don't have the whole story of this yet, and people are kind of oblivious. They don't know yet. But we had the whole story of that now, and we could look in there, and it's like Jeremiah was saying, yeah, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. He's like, wake up, and that's what I'm doing. I'm like, this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and this is happening now. Wake up, okay? So anyway. Okay, let me get into the main sermon here, and I'm going to have to do my best to switch gears. But now, if you've come that far with me, then I'm going to get into what William Branham would have done next, or what any of these guys would have done next, which is to start to piece together what's going on, the who's who, the where's where, and uh, and do it just exactly like they did. But I have to do it through a parable. Okay, that's the way that it's always done, is through a parable. So this is going to be like it's basically a parable. Okay, it's the way that I tell parables anyway, but it's the way they told parables too. They used historical references all the time as parables to explain what was going on. So that's what I'm going to do here. And the three ones that I want to hit upon today, because I have been thinking of three that are exactly the same thing. If you had a piece of, I always say it's like a piece of that paper, a piece of, if you've got like a legal document or something and you need to sign more than one, then you've got like a green piece of paper, a yellow piece of paper, and a red piece of paper, maybe a white piece of paper usually. And what it is it's a certain type of paper that whenever you sign one or whatever you write on the top goes through all of them, and then you can just pull one out on the bottom. You don't have to sign all of them. You just sign one time, and it went through all three of them. Okay, so you pull that bottom one out, and if you need an extra copy for it for the guy who signed it, then you just pull it out, and here's your copy. You signed it. Here's your copy. I got 3 copies here of what you signed, because it all the ink sunk through all of it. So I've been thinking about 3 copies of paper where that's been done through 3 or 4 that's been done throughout all history, and it's the exact same thing over and over and over. And this will be timely because one of those happens to be the 4th of July and the American Revolution. That's why I'm thinking about this. So anyway, what happened was the first one I'm going to use is King Saul. Okay, the Philistines, King Saul, David, that whole age. That's one piece of paper. Okay, the second one is Israel and Judah, the split between Israel and Judah. Okay, that is the exact same story. The exact same story as Saul and David and the Philistines and all that. Okay, then I'm going to do another one, and another one is exactly what we have went through with this battle between the Message and Don Parnell's side. That is exactly the same story as the other two. That is exactly the same story. We have had it in modern form. Okay? And I'm going to tell you all another one. The American Revolution was exactly the same story. All these have been exactly the same story. I mean exact. What they did was, what's going on here is we don't get caught up in all this big stuff. All that's going on here really is that we got a stack of these papers that bleed through. And all we do is, if you want to say us or whatever, however this thing's going, I'm not getting philosophical. I don't want to get philosophical. I just want to tell the story. It's simple. It's not a bunch of philosophy, really. I mean, philosophy's great. I like philosophy, but we don't need that, really. We need this is just a very simple truth. All this life really is. Don't get too far off of this and you'll do well. All that's really going on here is that there is a signed, it's like a stack of those papers, and it's signed. You can come in and check it if you want, wifey. It's signed, and it bled through all the way through. And what happened was the ink bled through all the way through all those papers. And in every one you pull out, you can pull out the pink copy, the yellow copy, the green copy, and that's what I'm going to do today. Every one you pull out of there is exactly the same writing. It's just a different colored piece of paper. That's the only difference, and that's a meaningless difference. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, that's pretty meaningless. The main thing is what you wrote on there. So it's like the plot of this story is wrote one time, and it bled through to every one of them. And you cannot go outside of that plot. That paper, it's always the same every single time. So if you understand what was going on one, you can pull out one piece of paper, and then you get down to where we're at now, and you got to dig down a few more, and then you pull out us. It's the same thing. It's the exact same thing. If you think there's anything different now than what's going on, nothing new under the sun, well, there's not. There's nothing new. You think any of this grand stuff that we've got to here is any different? It ain't. This grand stuff, this new message, all this stuff that we've been doing ain't no different than what they were doing then. It's just a different colored piece of paper. It's the only difference. Okay, so that makes it to where you can understand what's going on now. And the whole point of this is for us to understand what's going on now. Okay, everybody wants to say, well, we're doing amazing things now. And I'm like, yeah, well, they were saying we're doing amazing things now back then. It just blows me away. Okay, that people get off and it's way out in left field and this stuff, and it's not like that. Okay, so anyway, I mean, and I'm not saying we haven't done amazing things, but it's not really amazing in relativity, because that's what they were doing. If you want to look at it and say it's amazing, it's this age is different than all that. No, it ain't, because there was some guy in that age, in all those other ages, because the ink went through just the same on all those ages, where they looked and said, well, this age is different than all the other ones. No, it wasn't. It really wasn't. I mean, you could say it was maybe, but it wasn't. Ultimately, it wasn't. Okay, because there is nothing new under the sun. Okay, I know people don't like to hear that. People don't seem to like, they want to be like, well, we're doing something extraordinary great. Well, that's what they said then. We're doing something extraordinary great. And it was arguably true, but in relative terms, it wasn't true. Because, if it's not extraordinarily great if they've done an extraordinarily great thing in every single age. You know what I'm saying? It's really not extraordinarily great, even though perhaps it kind of is. Okay, so anyway, but what I want to do is I want to take all these papers and I want to give you a clear understanding of where we're at and what we're doing, okay, and who's who and what's what, because that's the point, for you to understand the age that you're living in, okay. Oh no, Brother Cook, you mean to tell me that all you've got is ultimately all you're going to tell me is that the same thing William Branham said? You're just rehashing William Branham whenever he said no, it's knowing your day and its message. Well, yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm giving you the it's knowing your day and its message version of 2026. That's what I'm doing. It's not anything different. I'm not trying to tell you that it's some extraordinary thing. I'm just telling you that it's the same thing over again, but it is kind of extraordinary for us right now because we don't know it necessarily. We're going through this one, you see. So that does make it, like I said, it's extraordinary, but it isn't extraordinary. This is not, I'm just saying the same thing. The same exact thing that William Branham said. So it's really not extraordinary, but it is. Okay? You all tell me at the end of this if it's extraordinary, if you think it's extraordinary or not. Or both or neither. So anyway, and all of them will probably be true. So, without further ado, let me see if I can do this. Because this seemed to strike my mind at this time of year. Okay. So let's start from the beginning. What you had was, I'm going to pull out the first piece of paper. What you had was you had the story of Saul and the Philistines and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so a little bit of backstory. The Philistines were the lords of the land. Yeah, they were, the Israelites were the promised whatever of the land. But the Philistines were basically lords of the land. That's why Samson had to go in there and pull down the buildings with his eyes poked out, Okay, the Philistines were the lords of the land, not the Israelites, okay? But we have to think of Philistines in a little bit different of a light than we always did. But anyway, that's a whole other story. But the Philistines and the Israelites were really the same people, roughly. They all lived in the same land, whatever. Okay, so anyway, so the Philistines were lords of the land. That's why you had the judges, the books of the judges, where the judges would come up, Samson being one of them, and they would alleviate the lords of the Philistine lords over them for a little while, and that was they were alleviators basically from the lordship. Okay, all right, and then eventually it came down to where King Saul led a full-on rebellion against the Philistines. And King Saul is very significant. King Saul wasn't just some guy who did this or that, and King Saul was very significant. King Saul is no different than like Paul or somebody. Paul is very significant. He's the first one in the New Testament, right? He's the first church age minister in the New Testament. That's why it's Saul and Paul, by the way. Okay, so anyway, these guys are very significant. Paul led a revolution against the establishment, essentially, of that day. Saul led a revolution against the establishment of that day, Philistines, whatever, So anyway, and then you had all these other characters, like you had Saul, and then you had David, then you had like a bunch of other ones, and all that they went through, right? But it's mostly Saul and David and the Philistines. It's pretty much the most part. Okay. So what that represented was, well, in simple terms, let me put it this way, and then I'm going to explain everything, but I got to get you to understand how that all these things connect. And it's so simple. It's just the simplest. It's unbelievable. I got to think about it. I thought, that's so simple. How it works is that you have nothing other but the simple story of a king and a rebellion. It's as simple as that. It's always a king and a rebellion. It's always, okay. The Philistines represented the concept of kingship, essentially. And they represented that concept of lordship, of that they were lording over them, and the Israelites, that's what they said, we want a king too. We want a king and we want to be a nation, essentially. So that was a rebellion, because the idea that you would have a king, that they would have a king, was a rebellion against the Philistines, because they were the king. Essentially, they were the lords of the land. They'd been the lords of the land all the way through the books of the Judges. And that's no different than any of the rest of it. Okay, so the next thing is, and I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to go back through it, but I got to show you the 4 things I'm going to use here, and then I'm going to go back through it, and I'm going to start detailing who's who and what's what, and then I'll get it up to our age, and then I will have a clear picture of what's going on all around us here. The second piece of paper I'm going to pull out that's been inked through is the story of the revolution, essentially, of the kingdom of Israel against the kingdom of Judah. Okay, so what happened was Solomon had died and Rehoboam was reigning in his stead, and to put it in biblical terms, and and so anyway, the people go to ask, well, how are you going to treat us? Because apparently Solomon was tough on them, and there's like, how are you going to treat us, Rehoboam? And it's like, my little fingers shall be thicker than my father's thigh. In other words, he was going to put them to the plow or whatever, I assume. So they're like, no, we ain't having this. So they all started a rebellion. They all proclaimed them a king, and Israel proclaimed them a king, and which was Jeroboam, and said, we're going to have us a rebellion. We're going to have our own country. We're going to do our own thing. That's the exact same thing that Saul did. Saul was Jeroboam. That's all he was. He was the first king. Saul, Jeroboam, Paul, George Washington, Don Parnell, it's all the same person. It's always been the same person, because it's always the first one who led a revolution against the kingship, against the lordship. For goodness sakes, people, listen to me. I beseech you, listen to me. Don't turn me off, okay? That's always been the same person. Every one of those has been the same person. Don Parnell is George Washington. I swear to you. He's absolutely George Washington. Okay. King Saul, George Washington. King Jeroboam of Israel, George Washington. King Jeroboam of Israel, Don Parnell, same person. King Saul in the Bible, Don Parnell, same person. George Washington, King Saul, same person. Okay. The Apostle Paul. I guess that's the 5th one I'm going to use, is the story of the apostles. The Apostle Paul, King Saul, Don Parnell, same person. It's the same exact type of person all the way through. Okay, so we can, once you clarify that, then, oh boy, there's lots of other people around that were significant in those ages that you can really figure out who they were too, right? So anyway, listen to me, folks. This is significant. Do not gloss over me today. Do not gloss over Brother Cook today. I'm telling you. So anyway, and then I'm going to detail it down. Since you all are catching my drift now, I'm going to detail it down. We're going to learn more about it. So what happened was let's run each one of them up. And before I get done with this, I want to let you know that the stories, I'm going to give you a different version of how the stories actually went that's actually better than the one that you would get from the mainstream media, let's say. The mainstream media of the message or of Christianity in general, of how they viewed it. I'm going to give you a little bit better idea on what was really going on there based on some newer facts that will clarify things a little bit better. But anyway, because it's not quite like it's been portrayed over the years. It's not quite as, well, nice, you might say. Anyway, so you had the Philistines, and the Philistines were lords of the land, and they represented the former kingship, right? Okay, and then what happens is the people want a revolution against the Philistines. So they call up Samuel the prophet and they say, hey, can you give us a king? We need a king so we can have a revolution against these guys. Because they were already the kings. The king of the Philistines, he was king over all of it, basically. And then what happened was the people wanted a revolution. They wanted a nation of their own, and then they had to have a king too. Okay, but it was like a revolutionary king, not a traditional style king. That's the difference. See, Don Parnell is a king. Okay, you didn't get rid of the kingship. You didn't get rid of the one-man kingship. Don Parnell became the one-man kingship, but he's a revolutionary king. He was a revolutionary king in the third coming and whatever. So you never get rid of the king. Everybody seems to think that you're going to get rid of the king. You don't get rid of the position of the king. He just becomes a revolutionary style king. That's all that happens. Because whenever they revolted against Judah, the first thing they did was they set up the nation of Israel, and Jeroboam became king. He was the revolution. He was the king of the revolution. George Washington was just as much king as King George III was. But they just retitled it as president, because he was the revolutionary king. President of the United States was really just shorthand for the revolutionary king. That's all it was. Remember, I'll give you all an example of this. I'll give you all, supposedly an angel from heaven that will back me up on this. As I recall, Don Parnell told the story of how that the angel, something was speaking to him, and it said something about your king. And it was referring to the president of the United States at the time, which was George W. Bush, right? I think. And it was probably going back to his 2002, all the stuff that happened to him, whatever. And so anyway, it said your king is now doing this or that, and it was like, king? Well, we don't have a king in America. We got a president. The angel wasn't fooled. The angel said king. I remember that specifically. And so, was George Bush our king? Well, we don't have kings here. No, George Bush was the king of America, because we don't call it king over here. We call it president, but it's still king. It's just a revolutionary style king. Okay, it's still king. The angel knew. The angel's like, yeah, he's your king. Okay, you could just drop the facade for a minute. He's the king. Okay, so anyway, the angel wasn't fooled by that crap. So anyway, so you had Saul was. It's like it seems a little odd. You get into it, and it's like, why were they asking for a king? They had a king over them, but that's how it works. It's really just a king. It's just they wanted a revolutionary king. That's profound. That's a profound understanding there. If you really nail that down, that's profound. That's not exactly the way we had it figured. So anyway, they wanted a revolutionary king. They wanted a king that, like in the American Revolution, they wanted a king that we elect every 8 years or 4 years or whatever, but it's still a king. It's still a position. You can't get around, I've said enough on that, but you can't get around that. It's the position of kingship. And the executive branch is essentially a kingship position type position. That's how it works. Okay. Now here it's like It's dumbed down to a smaller degree of things, of what kind of power it has. But they were doing the same thing in England, by the way. They've been doing it for 1,000 years with the Magna Carta and stuff. I'll get into that later. So it wasn't like that the Americans done anything new. But anyway. So King Saul is this revolutionary king. They go to Samuel and he's like, give us a king. And he's like, okay, I'll anoint Saul. He's the tallest dude, and he can be your revolutionary king, and he'll fight the Philistines, okay? All right, the Philistines represented the old kingship, right? Okay, then you get up to still good? Okay, then you get up to the next phase of it, which was Israel and Judah. And what you had was they said, well, we're not going to listen to you anymore and your lineage of David, Solomon and Rehoboam and whatnot, Judah. We've had enough of this. We're going to have us a revolution, and we're going to have a revolutionary king, right? And here's Jeroboam. He's the revolutionary king. Okay, so you had the same thing going on there. So then you had okay, I'll run the next one. Then you had Paul, the Apostle Paul. He was the revolutionary king against what was going on at that time, and that was the old Judaic law, the way that they had gotten into. That was the kingship that lorded over them, like King Herod and all that, the high priest and all that. That was the kingship, and they went and said, no, well, we're going to have the Apostle Paul here. So that was their revolution of that day. That was more of a spiritual revolution, I suppose, rather than a physical fighting and sword fighting one, right? Okay, but anyway, and then, or gunfighting, as the next one's going to be. And then, and there's a million others I'm leaving out. I'm just picking out 5 random ones here to explain this. Okay, and then we'll go up to the next one, the next in time frame. The next one I will use is the American Revolution. So you had King George III of England, and then you had the American colonists, and they're like, we don't want to be under this kingship anymore. We want our own king. So then they picked George Washington. And George Washington was essentially the king of the Americans. He was the revolutionary king of the Americans, okay? Same guy, okay? Because it's all, I said, the story is always about a king and a lordship, and then a revolutionary king and a revolution, essentially. That's what's going on, okay? But it's still always a king. You don't get rid of the king, essentially. But he just becomes a revolutionary king. So then, here's the next one I'll use, and the last one, the perhaps the most modern. Then what you had is you had like the message. The message represented the kingship and the lordship and the traditional things, like they represent like the same line of the Philistines. Like I said, you had Don Parnell, George Washington, the Apostle Paul, King Jeroboam, King Saul. Okay, these are all the same thing. Okay, now on the other hand, you have the message. You have the old Judaic law, the kingdom of Judah. The Philistines, whatever. Those are all the same thing too. Because when it was written down on the top, it's just not how it works, but it's just the way I'm going to explain it, the dumbed down way of explaining it. But when it was written from the top, they wrote, okay, revolutionary king, and then they wrote with the bleeding ink, and it bled through all the papers, and that was, it got down and so far, and you pull out the last one, and it's Don Parnell. Okay, then they wrote the old order of kingship and the whatever, and they went, okay, and then it all went through, and then no matter where you pull that out, that's either this or that or whatever. That's the Philistines, that's the kingdom of Judah, that's the message people, that's whatever. So that's there, and this is there, okay? All right, so it's all the same thing all throughout. So the message represented the kingship, the lordship idea of things. And then you had Don Parnell, which is the revolutionary king, the people had been in the bondage of the works, because remember I said what it was about, and when the age of Judah and Israel split, what they were concerned about was that Jeroboam was going to put them to work, apparently. And what it was he said, my little finger shall be thicker than my father's thigh, or whatever. So that supposedly meant, I guess, that he was going to put them to the plow, to the works. Okay. Well, that's what the message people are all about, is works. You got to do the works, essentially, And of course, they would probably dispute that to some degree, but compared to the Don Parnell people, they were definitely on the work side. Okay. Now, they might have been on the work side for the work's sake, because I'm not saying that they necessarily believe that, but by comparison, they definitely did. Okay. So anyway, so they said, well, we're gonna have these works. You've got to do what we and Branham said. You've got to do the works that we and Branham did, and then you got to do it exactly, like, literally. You have to have a literal interpretation of what we and Branham did, and you got to do the works, and you can't do this, and you got to wear this, and blah 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 blah. Works, essentially. Okay. And then the people all said, oh, they cried to God and said, whatever. And they said, oh, deliver us from these works and from these from this lordship that we've been under for thousands of years throughout the ages of all the 7 church ages. Free us from this. Give us our own king and our own nation. And God said, behold, let there be Don Parnell, and thus it was so, And so anyway, so Don Parnell became the, Samuel, as I'd said before, Samuel, William Branham, anointed Don Parnell through everything that he went through back in like 2002 or whatever. That was his anointing. And he had been anointed to be king over all of he was the revolutionary king against the message, lords, kings, the King George III of the message, whoever that might have been. Don Parnell was your revolutionary king against that. He's your George Washington. And so anyway, so then you had America. Then you had the third coming. Then you had Israel. The third coming. The third coming was none other than, like I said, Israel. You had Israel and your revolutionary king Jeroboam, and you had King Saul and the Israelites. Well, that's exactly what you got over here. You had George Washington and the Americans. That's exactly what you had here. What you had here was you had with this third coming message, was you had Don Parnell and the third coming message. That's no different than King Saul and the Israelites fighting against the Philistines. The message of the Philistines. That's no different than Israel and Jeroboam fighting against Judah and the original whatever, bloodline or whatever. Okay, that's no different. Okay, so now you understand where I'm at. You understand how that I can figure this out, of where I can start to go from there, right? Okay. All right, so let's detail it out a little bit more. Whew, man, a lot to say. Okay, but you all get where I'm at now. And everybody's pretty much going to agree with this to this extent, but anyway, you need to know the rest of the story. The rest of the story don't work out like probably everybody thinks, and there are what I would say as alternative viewpoints as to how we should look at history here. So maybe the way that it's been commonly looked at is not quite the right way to look at it. So anyway, I'm going to give you an alternative viewpoint of history, because at this point we have, well, Don Parnell's the hero and blah 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 blah, right? Okay. Well, that didn't turn out that was true, but that's not all that there was to it, right? Because King Saul really was a hero. George Washington was a hero, right? I mean, in regards to what they were doing, right? Okay. I mean, we know this, and but the rest of the story goes something to the effect of this. Let us think just a minute about all these times Now, where could I start? All right. I have to use a quote from a movie. I hope it's all right to do that. I know some of you will not have seen it, but it's called The Patriot with Mel Gibson. And what it was about was, and it was, trying to portray what was going on in the mindsets of the people during the American Revolution. Let me switch to kind of like primarily the American Revolution at this point, because that's what, I said this is the 4th of July message for me. So that's kind of where I'm going to go, but I'm going to hit some other things too on the way out. But let's kind of switch over to that for a minute and use that as the main historical reference for what I'm trying to explain here. In that movie, and I'm sure this had to be somewhat true to form, they had a meeting before they decided to full-on rebel against King George. They had a meeting, and they were debating whether they should actually go to war with King George III. The colonists, the American colonists, because the American colonists were the revolutionaries. They were wanting to be revolutionaries and make their own country and do the exact same things all the other ones. And so anyway, they're all in there and they're debating this, and you've got guys from one end of the spectrum to the other. You've got like guys that are like, we've got to have war now. We got to have war now. There's no two ways about it. We've got to go to war. We're trying to get you all to understand that we've just got to go to war. There's no other way about it. And then you've had people that said, we're debating, well, maybe war, let's try to reconcile with the king, this and that, And this was going on all through the ages. They all got up and had a debate. Every time that they went to rebel against the king, this is what it was. And so anyway, eventually Mel Gibson gets up, and to me, this is the most profound understanding of the whole thing. And when it comes to this sermon, Mel Gibson gets up, and he's just a regular, whatever, I don't know. And he'd been like a veteran in a previous war, so he had some clout enough to be there, right? So he gets up and he says, tell me this. He looks at the guy, and they're all debating it, and they're all like, we got to do this, we got to do that. And he gets up and says something totally different entirely. And he says, tell me, how is it? Why should I trade one tyrant 3,000 miles away, referring to King George, because he was, the lords over them were 3,000 miles away in England. And that's one thing they were kind of mad about, well, gee, shouldn't we have our own lords, essentially, it's whatever. And they were like that, and they were mad at the king, and he's 3,000 miles away, and they felt disconnected to some degree. He's like, why should I trade one tyrant 3,000 miles away, speaking of King George, for 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away? In other words, if we're going to have an elected legislature, that's what they were talking about, having an elected legislature that would rule over him as opposed to the king who was 3,000 miles away. We're going to have an elected legislature of us Americans who are all 1 mile away because we all live together. Then he said, well, what good does it really do to trade one tyrant 3,000 miles away for 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away? He said an elected legislature can trample the rights of man just as easily as a king can. So what was going on there was that none other than exactly that debate was none other than what we had in the message and the Don Parnell thing. Because the message was essentially the king 3,000 miles away. It was the concept of God lording over you, but it was done through them. It was done through the pastors and the church pastors, and they were all kind of they were the propagators of this idea that they used to lord over people with. And their idea was that God is 3,000 miles away. That had been all throughout the Dark Ages, all throughout the church ages, So and that was no different than the books of the Judges. That was what they had then. So, but anyway, it was the concept of God being far away, removed from you, and it was lording over you from a long distance. And that's exactly what you had throughout everything. You had in the days of the Philistines was like this removed God. They were Israelites. They were all one little thing here, and then the Philistine king, from another nation essentially, was ruling over them. So it was a removed God. It was a God not close. It's far and close. It's simple as that. Okay, so anyway, all of them were the same. You know, Judah, well, the guys in Israel were they were a long ways away from Jerusalem, you know, so that was the king was far. They wanted a king that was close. It's as simple as that. And so anyway, that's what they had in the American Revolution. They wanted kings essentially, or rulers that were close as opposed to far, because they felt, you know, for many different reasons, that didn't represent them, you know. So you know, taxation without representation, whatever. But it was just a far king that didn't represent them, and they wanted a close king that represented them. I'm telling you, listen to me, folks. Listen to me. Don't cut me off. I beseech you, like an Old Testament prophet, keep listening. If you've never listened to me before, if you've turned me off, listen now. If you think I'm crazy, if you think that, you know, they just think I'm nuts, don't turn me off. Okay, so anyway, it was a king afar off, and they wanted a king that was a little closer to the heart, you know, the Rush song, closer to the heart, right? So anyway, so that's what it was all about. Think of the Don Parnell Revolution. What was it about? It was about, the message had the idea that God was out here. And, well, maybe he spoke through his prophets. It's kind of like the Catholic Church, you know. The idea was God was out there and he spoke through the Pope. Okay? Well, the message had the idea that God was out there and he spoke, you know, through the message pastors, you know, if anything, and you had to go there to get it. And Don Parnell came along and said, nope. He said, what you've got is, he said, we're going to have a revolution against that, and we're going to make it to where you're God, and that you are the elected legislature. This is not a God afar off. This is a God in you. This is 1 mile away as opposed to 3,000 miles away. God ain't up here 3,000 miles away. God is inside of you 1 mile away. You see? It's the same thing. The American Revolution and the Don Parnell Revolution were the exact same thing. Okay? So anyway, but Mel Gibson, and this is where I go off the rails, according to most people, but I can prove it. Mel Gibson made a very good point there. And don't get me wrong, I fought in this revolution. So don't tell me anything. I fought for that revolution to get us away from the 3,000 mile away message king. Okay, so don't get too mad at me, because I fought in it. I fought as a patriot against it. Okay, and I fought for this. But Mel Gibson made a very good point in that movie. And I'm sure, you know, he was probably portraying somebody who had probably made roughly that same speech in reality. And that same argument has been made all throughout history. Did you hear what he said? He said, why should I trade one tyrant 3,000 miles away for 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away? Why? And that's where I drop off of this thing. Because what we have done now, in the fact that we fought against the king, the message king, and overthrew, for us, our sakes anyway, the 3,000 mile away God, now we're all God. But the problem is, we're all tyrants. Everybody that believes that you're God, you're nothing but a tyrant. You are a tyrant all within your own self now. That's all that happened. That what we did was we didn't really help anything. It's not about helping anything. It's just that this is the story. So like I said, somebody wrote it out, you know, that's just a stupid way of looking at it, you know. Somebody wrote it out and they said, okay, we're going to have this happen, and we're going to have this happen, and we're going to have this happen. There's no right or wrong really here. It's just the story. You got to go by the story, and you've got to play your part. It's got nothing to do really with right or wrong. It's just that you have to fulfill the scriptures. Okay, so we fulfilled the scriptures. The first thing was to have the king and the kingdom of Judah and blah 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 this, and have the message and blah 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 this, and the king 3,000 miles away, and he speaks through the message pastor, and then it came time that the scriptures said, well, now the next thing you've got to do is you've got to proclaim a revolutionary king, and then you've got to have a revolution, and you've got to do it this way. So that's what we did. It's as simple as that. We just did the next thing that was written to do. Okay, so then we had the revolution, the third coming revolution, and then we all said, well, we've had enough of this message, tyrant, and we're all gonna become tyrants ourselves. We're tired of having a tyrant that's 3,000 miles away in Jeffersonville or whatever, and I'm going to be a tyrant right here all to myself, and I don't need to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and I don't need to make a pilgrimage to Jeffersonville. I'm my own tyrant. Damn it. so anyway, at that point, we all became tyrants. At that point, we all became kings and lords, and we all come out under the Don Parnell Revolution with Don Parnell, George Washington, and we all fought the Revolution, and we all have come out, and we're still fighting the Revolution. The Revolution's still on, I think, and we all come out, and we said, and we fought against the message, King George and the British Redcoats, the blood system, and and that's probably why they wore red coats, and so anyway, because it was the bloodline. Because see, Judah, whenever they fought against Judah represented Rehoboam, Solomon, and David. It was the bloodline. It was the holy bloodline of David. That's what they were fighting against. So yeah, that would have represented the red coats, the bloodline. The red, England's color is red. Okay. So anyway, that's like their team colors, is white and red, right? So anyway, that went, and they wore the red coats, and everything was the English rose and blah blah blah, and the line, the line is the symbol of England with the line of the tribe of Judah. The whole thing is exactly the same. It rolls itself over again. I think about all this stuff all the time. So anyway, and then we get over here, and so but we get over here and we get away. We fight against the British message, and we make America. And America is the third coming by comparison. And Don Parnell's the first king, and he's George Washington, and he went out and fought against whatever. Okay, he's the first king. Okay, but the problem is what you have here is that the tyrantship didn't go away. The tyrantship just became all of us, an elected legislature, and we still have a king. He's a revolutionary king, but he's a king, and he's a tyrant. Okay, so now you've got, but let me clarify. Don Parnell is a tyrant. Okay, all right, but that's just the story. That's just the story. Don't get too mad at me. Don Parnell's a tyrant. In that regard, the way I looked at it at the time, I was a tyrant. Every Don Parnell preacher in the Philippines, they're tyrants. We're all tyrants. We were all tyrants. Okay, that's what I'm telling you. Okay, we were just tyrants 1 mile away. We didn't have to go to Jeffersonville and believe in a God 3,000 miles off. We're our own tyrants. We became our own tyrants, okay? Now, did this really help us any? Because I don't think so. It was just the next part of the story. That's what I was saying earlier. It's not about doing any better, really. It's not about good or bad. It's just the story. You just got to play the story. It's got nothing to do with, do you really help yourself? I think the equilibrium of all time just stays there. It's not really that you help yourself. You just have to you just have to play the part. It's not got anything to do. That's why I don't have any personal issues with anybody. I promise you, I've got to be the most least personal person ever. Because I realize it's just all the story that we're playing. It's not got anything to do with personalities, or unless that's part of the story. Then if somebody has got to have a personal problem with somebody else, well, that's just part of the story. So it's still not personal, or you could say it's personal, but it ain't. Okay, that's the way I look at it. So anyway. Maybe it's written in. Maybe it was written in that, hey, this guy's got to have a personal problem with this guy, because it seems like you run into that everywhere you go. Like people you work with or anything. It's just written in. Apparently, that's just the way it's got to be. So you look at the story of Saul and David. Well, they had personal traits that were just written in. That you look at Saul and David all throughout, and they just had personal traits that were just written in. That's just the way it's got to be. You just got to play the story. Okay, so you can say it's personal or it's not personal. It's just all the same. It don't matter. Okay, even the personal traits are not personal. It's just written in. Okay, so anyway, so we got over here, and now here I am in America. Okay, and I'm like, I'm I'm so glad to not be ruled by King Charles right now, King Charles III. You know, that's what an American would think. And we get over here, and I'm so glad we fought that revolution 250 years ago. You know, here's 250th anniversary of the 4th of July, right, of the Declaration of Independence for the Americans against the British. You know, here we are, 2026, from 1776 to 2026. Okay, so I'm going to shoot off some fireworks, and I'm so glad I'm free, you know, and this and that. Okay, forget it. You're not free. You're not any more free than you were then. You're just a tyrant. The elected legislature of Congress and all this and that, and the Senate and the president and all this and that over here is just a different version. It's just a revolutionary version of the same kingship problem that we had. Okay, we don't have to make a pilgrimage to London to the great Anglican Church anymore, but the Archbishop of Canterbury or whatever. But over here, it's the same thing, and dare I say, arguably worse. Because, and hear me out. Everyone's going to say, "Oh, are you going to say America is worse than England?" Hear me out. Okay, remember the story? Remember I could find some things out through the story because I can pull out anything I want and read it, you know? Okay. Well, perhaps that's a yes and no. Because think about it this way. Anybody who's ever read, and I'm going to make it as simple as this, anybody who's ever read the Old Testament and heard the story of what happened with Israel after they broke away with Judah, my question is, gee, was that really all that great? I mean, yeah, it was a great revolution, and they made their own nation, and instead of having to where, this guy, they had an archbishop of the Anglican Church that ruled over them. They made it to where, well, anybody can start their own church, and we're going to have separation of church and state, and, anybody could be a Baptist preacher or a Pentecostal preacher or a Methodist preacher or whatever, or whatever. And that was exactly what they did. Whenever they broke away from Judah, they said, the two things was that they, a couple of the things was that they didn't want to have to go to Jerusalem probably to make a pilgrimage, and B, only the Levites could be priests. So back in England in the Anglican Church, you had set up priests. Okay, so only certain people could be priests. And then you come over here and we had separation of church and state. So at that point, everybody could be a priest. Well, that's, anybody could go up in any holler in West Virginia or Kentucky or somewhere and make up a church. You didn't have to be officially approved by the Anglican Church or the Catholic Church or whatever, something like that. Okay, so anyway, that's what it was. The Levites could only be priests, but whenever they rebelled against Judah and the system, then it was where you didn't have to be a Levite to be a priest. So essentially, anybody could be a priest. Anybody could start a church. It was what that represented was separation of church and state. You see, it didn't have to be that you had to be a Levite. You had to be approved by this and that. Before you could do, and that's like denominational church history. That's all way down through there. You had to be approved by the head of the church or whatever before you could make your own church or whatever. A little offshoot church. That went all throughout. So anyway, of course, everybody would say, "Well, wasn't that better, Brother Cook?" Well, I don't know. I really don't know because I don't think it's any better or any worse. I think it's just the story. It's just the story. Okay. Because we're just by doing all this, basically what happened was we just played the story out. We just fulfilled the scriptures. All you've got going on out here is a fulfillment of scriptures. Whenever Jesus came to John and he said, well, we've got to fulfill it. He's like, I need to be baptized to you. What do you want me to baptize you for? John's looking at Jesus like, you're the dude, man. You're the dude. And he looks at him and he's like, well, yeah, we got to fulfill the scriptures, so you got to baptize me. So, you just got to fulfill the scriptures. That's all we're doing here. That's all it is. There is no thought to it. You just go around, and any of your thoughts that you have is just a fulfillment of scripture. Any of the characteristics that you have is just a fulfillment of scripture. That's all it is. You don't really, this is going to get way out there, but you don't really, you have a choice, but the choice is really only an illusion. It's only to ultimately you really don't have a choice. It's like I said about everything being extraordinary but not extraordinary. It is extraordinary, but it's not extraordinary. Ultimately, it's not extraordinary. So you have a choice in your mind about the way things work, but the scriptures have to be fulfilled. So you're going to end up doing it one way or another. There's no the choice is part of the scriptures. The way that you're able to think and reason and try to figure out which way you want to do something is a part of the fulfillment of the scriptures, but ultimately you will end up doing it one way or another. So you have an extraordinary capability to reason and think and try to figure out the way you want to do something and have choices in your mind as to the way you want to go about it, but ultimately the scriptures will extraordinarily be fulfilled. See? So you it's only really an illusion, I think, that you have a choice. But you do have a choice, but it's really not a choice. So anyway, and all of our characteristics that we have are fulfillments of the scripture. Every characteristic that you have as this person or that person or whatever, or the way that you look at this or the way that you look at that, is just ultimately a fulfillment of scripture. Okay? So anyway, because that's all that's going on here. It is, as what was the Arabs that said, it is written. You couldn't, they would always say, it is written. Well, they were right, really. It is written. You can't go off of the way it is written. You can't go off of that. You're not going to go off of that. If you think you're going off of that, that's what you're doing to fulfill it. If you think that if somebody thinks that, well, I don't think it's that way, Brother Cook, you're fulfilling Scripture by thinking that you don't think it's that way. That's all you're doing. You can't escape it. Okay? I know people probably would hate that because that's like a confining thought process. But you do have the ability to think that you could go outside of the bounds of it. So you do still have the ability, but ultimately you don't, is what I think. Now, this is getting philosophical. I didn't want to get philosophical today. I wanted to just tell the story of the message and what's going on. So I'm going to remove myself from this, and I'm going to try to go on with what little bits of information that we can glean from what we've already come up with here to tell who people are and what they're doing. Okay. All right. Now, I have said at times past that I think I'm King David. I think my position is David. Now, if there's a better David out here, like William Branham said, he said, apparently said, if this isn't the coming of Christ, it sure looks a lot like it. Okay, so if there's a better David out here, I think I'm King David. So if there's a better one out here that, this to me, I look a lot like it. Okay, if I'm not King David, I sure as heck look a lot like it. So to me, so I'm going to preach it as thus. Okay, so anyway, if not me per se, then I at least embody the characterage, and this generation will embody the characterage of King David. This generation after King Saul, after Don Parnell, this the 40-somethings or whatever out here right now, they have to be King David. They have to represent that because that's what happened next in the story, you see. That's what the next fulfillment of Scripture is David, because we know Don Parnell's King Saul. We know that. He was the first one. He's George Washington. He's all these things. We know that. Okay, so this generation, his generation represented Saul. It was the first one to come out. Then we go to David. It's as simple as that. It has to be. Okay, so based on all the rest of it, So anyway, it's just, if you don't like, I'm just a representative. I could be the representative, but I'm a representative of this generation, if nothing else. And this generation represents the concept of David. There's no doubt about it. It represents the concept of David, the concept of Jonathan, the concept of King Saul's son that reigned in Israel, the whole thing. Okay, all those people are represented in this generation. They have to be. Okay, so anyway. David, in terms of the message after, because remember I said that there's a message after this King Saul message. There's a message after this message Pentecostalism. There's a message after the third coming. There's a message after the love divine. There's a message after all this. And that's where we got to go to, because remember I said, I started at the beginning when I said, it's not about just being able to understand William Branham's message in a new light. You got to be able to go beyond that. That's not necessarily it. You got to be able to do something beyond that. Okay, so I explained all that. Okay, so that's where we're at now. We're in the next message after that. We went beyond that. Okay, so anyway, we went beyond the idea of going beyond everything. That the whole point was to go beyond everything. We went beyond going beyond. Okay, because that's what the revolution is always about, going beyond. It's about going beyond this old kingship and the old way of looking at things, okay? Now, here's where it gets really funny. Here's where I started looking at things and I thought, there might have been more to it than what we thought. We all look at, if you didn't read the scriptures much, you would just, let's use David for an example. Because this is the Davidic generation, is what I'm saying here. This is Don Parnell was the King Saulic generation. This is the Davidic generation, okay? So, what did King David do? King David, at times, would see King Saul. He fought with King Saul in terms of fighting the Philistines. And then he fought with King Saul in terms of fighting with King Saul, okay? This is just the scriptures, folks. So then what happened was eventually King David, David at the time, David, there's a story, and I always think of this, and I thought, man, that's really far out there, man. This is going to be some really far out there thought today. Did you ever remember the story where David went and stayed with the Philistines? You know, the same David that went out and killed Goliath and slew foreskins and slew Philistines and foreskins and got foreskins of the Philistines and brought them all back and said, here, King Saul, you said if I slew 100, you give me your daughter. Well, here's 200. You know, this King David that was just gutting the Philistines. Okay. Sure enough, after he's run from King Saul and him and King Saul had their differences, what does he do? He goes and essentially joins up with the Philistines. Now you think about this. You think how unthinkable that could be. David had killed 1,000,000 of them, and he goes and joins up with them essentially. But they wouldn't let him fight. They wouldn't let the Philistines go out to fight against Saul in his last battle in which he was killed. And David, as I recall, don't quote me on this, but as I recall, he wanted to go fight against King Saul even. He had got to the point that he wanted to fight against King Saul. And they said no. He said the Philistine lords all got together, and I think David was under the Lord of Gath or something in the Philistine lands. And they said, no. I said, he's been with me all this time, and he ain't done nothing against me. He's not done anything against us. We know he's David. He killed 1,000,000 of us, but him and his crew here, they haven't, they've been pretty good. They've helped us when whatever, and they all got together and they said, well, okay, yeah, but we can't take the chance that if we go out and fight against Saul, that David and his crew won't get out there and turn on us at some point and fight for his former lord, King Saul, basically. So we're just going to leave him here. We're not going to take him to the battle. We're just going to leave him here. So David couldn't go fight with them. Okay. But here's a question. What the heck's David doing with the Philistines? Here's what I think it represents. I think it represents that David had concluded that the mess, to me, this is why I think this. I think it meant that David had looked at everything that went on with the revolution, and he began to have second thoughts on whether that was the best idea or not. Because the revolution, the tyranny that King Saul and the Israelites had fought against was really just put on him by King Saul. Because like I said, remember I said that the king, he's a king, but he's a revolutionary king, and they were all tyrants, So what was going on was, I think, was that, and based on from what I could see, this kind of makes sense, is that David had probably been tyrannized so much by his own people that he probably figured that the tyranny of the Philistines was probably less bad than his own damn people. That's what I think. I think that he had run from King Saul. He had been tyrannized by his own people because they became a tyranny after they gained their independence from the Philistines, because they declared independence the day that King Saul was anointed and started fighting against them. They were fighting in a war for their independence, and they had already declared independence. Might have still been fighting against the Philistines, just like the Americans were fighting against the British, but they had already declared independence. Okay. So what happened was, I assume, and I'm going to give another historical reference to back this up as to why I think this is true. But I assume David concluded, given the fact that he concluded that since he was a little bit different of a situation, that and he ended up being at odds with King Saul and the Israelites in general, that he probably got so far out there to where he concluded that actually King Saul and the Israelites were more tyranny to him than the Philistines were. That's just a guess. And that's what I think probably happened. It stands to reason. So that's about where I'm at. I think that this generation, this Davidic generation, if you understand what the message really is right now, then you will understand, if you try to say anything about what the message is now in the court of King Saul or with the Israelites, then they will tyrannize you probably harder than the message people would if you tried to tell them. Truly, truly. The things that this generation of a message believes or will believe will be tyrannized probably harder by Don Parnell and company than even by the message people. And I mean that as that's just part of the story. Remember I said everything's part of the story. It's not personal. That's just the way it has to play out. But I can tell you from experience that I have been trying to say for the longest time, or I don't anymore, had tried to say things in the court of King Saul, the Facebook court of King Saul. I had tried to say things. I'm sure many others of this generation have tried to say things, and they have been just deleted or cut off or whatever. They have been tyrannized by this system, this revolutionary system that was supposed to free us from the old guard. You know, it was nothing but another system of tyranny, is all it is. And what it is, but that's just how it works. But what it is I assume David probably just realized, hey, I might as well just go hang out with the Philistines, because he probably figured I might as well just, if I were going to hang out with anybody, I'd probably just be better off hanging out with message people even than I would be with these people, because they are. Because you would get, if you tried to say anything, let's just put it this way. If you tried to say anything right now, I feel as though if I tried to say anything like all this right now, if I tried to go and say, a lot of this stuff that, there's a message going beyond things, then stuff like that, which I had tried for years. I had tried to say that, and every bit of it was met with ire and deleting messages, and been called every name in the book, and been called an egoist and everything for just trying to say my generation's message. Okay, at some point, I feel as though, speaking for me personally, I would probably rather hang out with the message people at this point, as opposed to try to hang out with third coming love divine people at this point, or whatever you want to call them. Truly. Okay, so not saying the Philistines are great, but it's better than being killed by King Saul. Because Jonathan, remember the story about Jonathan? And Jonathan had to shoot the arrows and say, it's because he didn't know whether King Saul was going to try to kill him or not. And King Saul tried to kill him all the time. And all that is deleting messages. All that is killing your influence. It's like one of the preachers, I won't mention his name, but but he said that it was a killing of influence, and he was 100% right. And so that's what's going on here, is that, and it's just playing their part. But the Don Parnell side of things has played its part and killed and tried to kill by javelin the influence of this Davidic generation, of this next generation's message. It wouldn't let it speak. Okay? So that's what King Saul did. You know, you can't be King Saul and only have the good. I'm sorry, it ain't gonna work that way. You know, the good. King Saul tried to kill David with javelins all the time. You know, he was always trying to kill him with javelins. He was trying to do everything. You remember that story? Okay, everybody remembers that story? Okay? So, you know, we can't leave it as, yeah, Saul was the first king of Israel, the revolutionary king, and he did all this super awesome stuff. Yeah, well, he also tried to kill David with javelins. Okay, and we know who David turned out to be later on. He turned out to be the king. So anyway, so that's what you had. That's what you've had with this Don Parnell message, with the love divine, all the stuff that they've done, their revolutionary civilization here. If you tried to be a David and tried to say something other than that, then you have had javelins thrown at you. You have had your messages deleted. You've had this and that to where you couldn't speak. You know, so anyway, so David had to hide out in the wilderness, essentially. And then he ends up with the Philistines ultimately. You know, so what the heck's David doing with the Philistines, you know? So anyway, but after all that, the Philistines, they were going out to fight King Saul. And they might really, truly have been right. You know, I mean, I thought about this too, you know, just deep diving here. The Philistines the Philistine lords that said, whenever the guy who, the Philistine lord that was over David, where he was at, they all got together, and the one guy says, well, he's been great since he's been here, and, you know, he's helped us, whatever, and they all said, yeah, okay, but we can't take the insurance risk of taking him out to fight against his former lord, because he might he might get out there and decide he wants to join up with them against us. Valid argument. It's like this. I would say, I don't think David probably would have done that. I think that was what it was implying. But anyway, he didn't go out. That was not the scriptures. They didn't let him go out. So what I'm saying is this, I am of the mindset, and this generation should be of the mindset, that we have gotten to the point that we would about rather hang out with message people than we would our own Israelite people. That's how bad it had gotten to, you know, wanting to kill our influence. Okay, and I would be willing, practically, to join up with them if they would let me preach. If a message person would let me preach in their church, you know, or go up to battle against King Saul and this third coming love divine, the whole bit of it, then, you know, who knows what would be said. But that's not how the story goes. But David did seem to be willing to go, but they wouldn't let him go. So to be honest with you, I'd probably be willing to go to a message church at this point and talk about how ridiculous that the third coming in love divine, this side of things has gotten. I would be willing probably to do that. But that's probably not going to happen. Because, you know, the Philistine lords, the message lords might actually be correct in saying, well, you know, gee, he might get up there and start preaching against us and join his former lord. That might actually happen. I might get up there and say, you know, I might get up there and just start raking everybody over the coals, you know, and saying, well, gee, you guys didn't, you know, but I probably wouldn't, because I don't know. Anyway, who knows? That was not how the story went. But I'm just saying, I just get to thinking about this stuff, and I think, you know, but that's the story, folks. I mean, it really has truly happened. Our generation, anybody that tried to say, to have an opinion, anybody who was an Israelite, anybody who fought in the revolution against the message, but also had the Davidic ideology of it, because you've got two ideologies out here, and they've always been out here. You've had the King Saul, Don Parnell, roughly, ideology of things. And then there's been another one. It was little David, nobody ever knew about. David has been out here trying to preach, and King Saul's been chucking javelins at him because it was just what had to be done. It wasn't time for him to be king yet. They had to go through all this stuff. And one day, long after King Saul has finished up his reign, David will be king. This generation that the 40-somethings, the millennial generation or whatever, one day it's going to be king. One day David out here is going to rise up because he was anointed. He was anointed shortly after King Saul was anointed king, but King Saul had to run his course. King Saul had to chuck the javelins at this generation for trying to say whatever they wanted to. That's what has to be done. That's just the story. It's nothing personal at all. It's just how it works. At times, they embraced it. It's a sad story. It's a sad story. Whenever you read the story, of Saul and David, it's a sad story. So, it's like the generational thing. You have that in every generation, I think. You have a Saul and a David to some degree. It don't matter if it's this time or all the other times or in between every little message that was ever preached, there was always a Saul and a David. And that's just the way it has to go. And it's always a sad story. I feel as though I would be preaching to the choir. I know that I wasn't down in the Message Church very long, and it was a bit of a hard thing to leave, but anyway, I know I'd be preaching to the choir if I said that it wasn't a hard thing whenever the Third Coming people left the churches that they were in, but it had to be done. And they got javelins through at them because that's just the way that it's. Every generational gap of things, of message to message, is this way. And it's always a hard thing to go through. And so it's been no different here. It's been no different of a hard thing to attempt to move from the Don Parnell generation and think something different. And this generation, maybe it doesn't know it yet, but it's going to have its own revolution of sorts. It's going to have its own Davidic group that has to go through this, and it will be hard to step away. But that's just what has to be done. It will be hard to take the blows whenever, they're going to have something to say. It always happens. And they're going to have something to say that's generational, and they will have javelins thrown at them by this generation that we come out of. But it has to be done, and it will be a hard thing. And it has already been for me personally. But as I said, it's nothing personal because that's just the scriptures. So if it chokes me up, then, well, that's just fulfilling the scriptures. So, but it's like you read that story in the Bible about David and Saul, and man, that's a rough one there. So, so anyway, it's rough. But anyway, I guess I could give one more little example of what I'm saying here. Talking about how that David went and joined the Philistines. I think what it represents a mindset, really, because I feel as though that William Branham, I thought about this too. I feel as though that William Branham, whenever he come out of the Pentecostal movement, he probably concluded that the Baptists were actually better than the Pentecostals to some degree. I imagine he was sitting around thinking, man, I don't care much for either one. My message is to say that I really, either one was a mess, but I just feel as though he probably at least had the thought of, gee, man, this Pentecostal movement got so wild that it might have actually been, the Baptists might have actually been a little better. so that's the way I look at it. Is I feel that David probably said, probably got to looking at the Israelites and King Saul and all that they were doing and chucking javelins at him, and he thought, man, was I better off when the Philistines ruled things? I mean, it is probably that's probably what that represented, was him joining the Philistines. Probably represented the thought, because everything now has a lot to do with thought. And it was probably just simply the thought of, man, was I better off in the mess age rather than having javelins chucked at me for trying to tell things in the third coming? Maybe. So anyway, I'll give you one more example on the way out. One more example that I always think of when I think of this stuff is there was a case of this. I think roughly a case of this in the American Revolution, and the case of this was that there was a general. I think he was a general at the time, who fought on the side of the Americans in the Revolutionary War. And I think he got shot in the leg even. And ended up to where he became, as I recall, like governor of Pennsylvania or Philadelphia or something. They give him a post of command. And they just treated him kind of like crap. And it was like the way that everything worked, it was just they kind of treated him bad. The Americans did, and he had been a war general. He wasn't even acknowledged for having won. There was one battle, I think, where he had won the battle, and while apparently, and I don't know if this is the same story or not, but this guy had won the battle, and against the British, fighting for the Americans. And while that the general of the army that was supposed to be in command of the American army was supposed to have spent, I think this is the same time, was supposed to have spent the day, basically, while the battle was going on, spent the day arguing the causes of the war with a captured British soldier or something. And anyway, while that's going on, this guy goes out and wins the battle, and is just totally not recognized for it. And then he's given a post. Some people recognized his prowess as a general, and they ended up giving him somewhat of a post, and then they give him a hard time over that. And then anyway, he was recognized, but George Washington was even going to give him a command, I believe, but by then it was just he had had enough. So he was totally against the British, fighting against the British as an American, and then he had enough. He's like, well, my gosh, these people are treating me worse than they did. So he actually turncoats and goes and rejoins the British and ends up being a British general. Okay, to me, that's kind of the situation of David. The guy's name, by the way, was Benedict Arnold. Okay, so if you know the story of Benedict Arnold, see, all the Americans, that's what I'm saying. People don't know, if they knew history and they knew the whole entirety of it and alternative histories and stuff, and don't just look at it the way that it's painted this way or that, then they would just look at it and say, well, Benedict Arnold, he was a piece of crap. That's all they know about that. The American history's version of Benedict Arnold is, in general, well, he was a piece of crap. He was a turncoat. But if you know the story of Benedict Arnold, the story of Benedict Arnold was far more detailed than that. He was not just, you couldn't just leave it as though, he was a piece of crap. He was, the story of how the Americans pushed him to the point that he ended up rejoining the British there was a lot more to it than he was just a piece of crap. They had pushed him far enough. He had had enough the way that they treated him. And I would say this, you might be an American revolutionary, but I might be or somebody out here might have even fought for the revolution against the message, but you can treat somebody bad enough to where even if they're on your side and they believed wholeheartedly in the whole, every bit of it, the whole, well, I'm God and I'm fighting against the king 3,000 miles away. You could treat somebody so bad whenever they were trying to fight for the cause. You can treat them so bad that they would about go and join the other side and fight against you. You could do that. And I think that that's exactly what happened with David. He had had enough. He had been javelined enough. He just had enough. They pushed him so far. David was an Israelite. He fought against the Philistines wholeheartedly. But they treated him like crap, and he just left. So you can do that. I'm saying this, and not just for me. That's my story, to be honest. I got treated like crap. I had enough of my stuff deleted to where I'm probably not going to, I'm just not, I've been called an egoist for having ideas, everything, I was just trying to move us forward. That's what David was doing, because he was the next generation. He was trying to move it forward. And I'm sure there are many others that just simply had ideas, because David wasn't the only one. There was a crew of guys with him. He wasn't the only one. There was some men of Judah that were with him. And I'm telling you, there's some men of Judah out here that have tried to say things, I guarantee you, on Facebook, and have been javelined, just like David was. And they've had enough. They would rather live in the wilderness or live with, or practically go to hang out with, come to the conclusion, well, dang, the message was not as bad as this. That's what they would do. And that's the conclusion I came to, is that, my gosh, man, the message wasn't practically as bad as this. I mean, you can't even get on there. What kind of tyranny is this? You can't get on. You can't say anything, without being javelined to death and being called every name in the book. What kind of that's more tyranny. That's just that's practically more tyranny than what we had with the message people. What's the difference? What's the big difference here? And so I concluded, well, if it's going to be like this, I'm just going to skedaddle, as we would say here. I'm y'all go ahead. I'm going to hang out with these guys if that's, you've pushed me to this extent. So I've been pushed to the extent of being javelined, having my message javelined to death by the people that were my people, to the point that I'd practically about rejoin with the message people. That's what this has come down to. The thought would cross my mind. That's, if I were going to join with anybody, which I probably wouldn't, but if I were going to, it's just a thought. You pushed me to have that thought. That's a problem. They've pushed people to have this thought. And I'm sure that's a lot of what's going on out here. It ain't just me. Forget me just a minute. You think about how many people out here, I guarantee you, have been pushed out of this message back to the message. I bet you it's been plenty. I bet you those men of Judah that fought for this idea of the American Revolution, fought for it, that were pushed back out. I guarantee you, I'm not the only one. And I guarantee you that they had good ideas too, just like Benedict Arnold. He was a good fighter. He was trying to push it forward, and he was a great fighter. He was underappreciated. And I guarantee you, there have been plenty of people that had ideas that were underappreciated and were treated just like Benedict Arnold on the Facebook, where everybody communicated, the Facebook page or everything, or whatever, or in the churches in the Philippines or wherever. I guarantee you there have been plenty of them. And that's who I'm giving a call out today, for any of those Davids, for any of those men of Judah that were with King David. I'm calling out for if you're in the woodwork, here we have a cave over here you can come and get under. We're practically considering going and hanging out with the Philistines here. The thoughts crossed our mind. I mean, come unto me, all you that are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. The tyranny used to be the message. Well, now the tyranny is the third coming. The tyranny is that you can't have a thought outside of the third coming catechism of what it's gotten to be. You can't have a thought outside of, it's this way and it's this way and it's this way, and you gotta do this and that and this and that, and it's it's just a new catechism, because America turned out to be just a new catechism after all. I mean, it was just a new form of government. It was a revolutionary form of government by comparison to the message, or to the British in a sense, but it's still just another catechism essentially. They all turn into catechisms. What I'm saying would eventually turn into a catechism, or my generation will eventually turn into a catechism. But that's what it did. So, who's the tyrannizers now? So anyway, I think that's about it. Hopefully my phone hasn't shut off. I don't really have anything more to preach, but I just like to say this. I like to talk as a human being here for once. I get into preaching, and preaching's kind of like, you're almost like non-human or something when you preach, sometimes. But I would just, come down to where the old prophet, he was preaching, and he said, he had to be just going, I beseech you, and that's what I would say. I beseech you to listen to this. I beseech you to give this an ear. I beseech you to don't just gloss over what Brother Cook has said here. Me as a human being, me as just the old prophet before he got wound up preaching, he said, I beseech you, listen, and then he started preaching. Well, I beseech you, listen. This is important. This is huge. This is not just something you gloss over, folks. And I tell you, I'm going to leave it on one more thought here. There is one more thought. I hope it's okay. There's of course it's okay, because it's written, right? But anyway, there's a lady that I think she's dead now. Her name was Dolores Cannon, and she was saying a lot of the same stuff that like the Third Coming said, but she had kind of like different ideas on it too. And she was not affiliated with the Third Coming as far as I ever knew. But anyway, she was just she like predated the Third Coming and had ideas like that moving into the new heaven, the new earth, and all this and that, and that the earth was going through a transition and whatever. So anyway, but they asked her, they said, well, what's your ideas on God? Because essentially those people that were with her basically believed the same concept of, God is this one thing, and everything emanates from the one, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, basically what the love divine Third Coming, the whole concept of that. And she looked at him and she's like, well, really what God is, if you want to call it anything, is God has parents. God has a God. God, it's just like fractal theory. Everything it's the same, but it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And she said, God has a God, and then that God has a God, and then that God has a God. And, which is profound. That's a profound statement. You should just, if anybody heard that, they should, especially back then, they should have just looked at Dolores and said, wow. They should have stopped and said, wow. But they weren't smart enough to do that. What they did was they looked at her and they said, yeah, but does that ultimately still have a one thing in which everything come from? And you'd have to face palm if you think about it. You have to look at it and be like, how stupid are you, man? You had this idea of that everything comes from the one, and Dolores Cannon just blew that out of the water. And all you can do, you can't appreciate the fact that she had this great idea. You've got to try to take what you had previously believed and stick it in there. You can't listen and say, oh, well, that's something, and just leave it at that. You got to try to take all your previous ideas, that everything that you believed about everything, and try to force it in there and say, well, okay, but how do I still keep my idea? And I'm not saying this has not got anything to do with what God really is there, whatever. But I'm just saying that what people do is it's like a lot of times you can say something and they're so stuck on their idea that they can't stop for a minute and just say, wow, that's mind-blowing. That's good. They're like, listen just enough to, and be like, back of their mind, they're still like, okay, so how does my previously conceived idea fit into this? Stop with your damn previously conceived idea. Stop with it. Give it up. When you get to something that is mind-blowing, take the mind-blowing and forget the previously conceived idea entirely. Okay? Don't try to fit what you previously believed into something in the future, into something greater than that. Because it's like, to me, I could just imagine if I was to tell somebody, if understanding William Branham's message in a new light is not the Holy Ghost, proof of the Holy Ghost, the modern Holy Ghost equivalent, then they're going to be like, okay, cool, Brother Cook, but how can I fit all my ideas that I already believed into that? They're not just going to look at that. You should just stop and be like, wow. You should stop and say, wow, that totally changed everything. But it doesn't seem that people want to do that. That is it. I told you it. I told you the message of this age. It's been told. It's already out. That is it. The idea that this message and the whole sermon here is just to get you to understand that really the one side wasn't any better than the other. That is it. That's the message. That was William Branham's message. He was just trying to get them to understand Pentecostalism really wasn't any better than the Baptists. That's it. That's all it was. And that's what I'm trying to tell you all. This Don Parnell side of everything is really not any better than the message. Ultimately, it's really not any better. It's just the equal opposite approach that we had to go through to get to here. Pentecostalism was the equal opposite approach to Baptistism that they had to go through to get to William Branhamism. That's all it is. It's just filling the scripture. That's it. That's all it is. But you got to understand that. You can't just, because a Pentecostal would look at that and said, they would have just looked at that and they would have just right over their heads, So anyway, that's what I'm saying. You got to stop. You got to stop, and you got to listen, and you got to not let that just go over your head. Don't let that just don't say, oh well, that was just a conversation in passing. That's not a conversation in passing, folks. That is the message for this age. Is what that is. That is not just some little something. Okay, that's not some little. Well, I come up with this and it's cool. No, that is the message for this era. That is the message for this age. That is not something to be glossed over. Okay, that is it. Okay, of course, I realize that once you think you've found it, well, you haven't found it. I realize that. So it won't be it. But for somewhat of a time, it is perhaps it. Until we find something better, that's the message of the age. So it is kind of the it for now. But the it is never it. Whatever I'm saying now or whatever anybody's ever said that it was it perhaps for a time, it's still not going to be the it. And that's another thing that gets me. Okay, one more. Let me see if it's still working. Okay, it's still working. One more. Try this. I'm going to throw this at you. Here's some thoughts I have. Because preaching to me is kind of like the message, but it's like borderline philosophy, whatever. So this might get more philosophical, but it kind of ties in with the message because I'm more about the message. I'm not interested in, I'm interested in philosophy because the message and philosophy are very close. So, they do tend to blur the lines. But when it comes to, let me give you all a thought here before I go. And not to discount everything I've said here because this is profound. I beseech you, listen, folks. But, what was I talking about? Talking about the it and how that the it is it for the age, but it's not necessarily the it for all time. Here's one thing that gets me, and this is just me thinking here. This is just me, whatever. But we'll call this philosophy with Brother Cook. The stuff I think about is if you're in an age, it's like, my question is this. Doesn't it seem a little funny that in the age that we invent video games, that everybody says, oh, well, everybody gets on this bandwagon of thinking that, well, the world must be a big video game. Gee, really? You know, you just invented video games like 40, 50 years ago, and now everybody concludes that the world's a big video game. Okay, you know? And now I'm not saying it's not a big video game. It might very well be, but, you know, we get to where we can invent holographic images, and everybody's like, oh, well, the world must be a hologram. I'm like, gee, well, you know, could that just be the it of this age? Maybe the world isn't necessarily a hologram more than it's anything else. Maybe it isn't a video game more than it's anything else. Maybe that's just what you believe. Maybe that's just what you believe because, gee, that's what the age is. And I'm not saying that isn't the it, but that won't be the it for all time, because what will they invent 250, 100 years from now that will, you know, just won't even be a video game? It won't even be who knows what. You know, I don't know what it'll even be. And then in that age, they're going to look at it and they're going to be like, well, in this age, we invented this hoop-de-doop-de-doo here, and then, so we think everything's a hoop-de-doop-de-doo. You know, we think the universe is a hoop-de-doop-de-doo. You know, we thought, well, back then we thought, well, we invented video games this age, so we think the universe is a video game. Okay, well, that may be the case for right now, but that may not be the case for all time. You know, what about a Neanderthal caveman, you know, or whatever, or something? You know, he probably thought that the whole universe was one big saber-toothed tiger hunt, you know, because that's all he knew at the time, or whatever, something like that. You know what I'm saying? You know, you know, you could give 1,000 examples. You know, the guys riding the Conestoga wagons across country. You know, they never heard of a video game, obviously, so they probably thought, you know, the universe must be one big Conestoga wagon ride across some great west of the universe, you know, and that's what they were just comparing it to their age. So I don't get too much into comparing everything to our own age. And I'm going to tell you something else. I mean, I do, you have to, but you don't. It's like, that's what I'm saying. Everything I told you in this sermon, that's just for right now, but that won't hold water 50 years from now, you know. And everything that we've been saying throughout all these times, that's what I'm trying to say. You got to go on. We got to do something different. And even going on and all the other stuff that we had for the past 20 years here, we got to go beyond this. That was the it for the age, but it ain't it now. You got to do something else. So anyway, you know, we had like the video game age. Well, now we got to have the AI age, you know. Brother Cooks will say, well, everything's AI, you know, or whatever. I'm sure they've already said that, but anyway, you know, I'm not saying that, but I mean, you know, really, you could look at it that way. It's just a way of looking at it based on the time frame that you're in, is what I think. You know, it's just like the different colored paper. Well, one time you look at it from a lens of yellow paper, and one time you pull out the next one and it's a white paper, and then eventually you get down and you probably run into another yellow paper, you know, whatever. So, or however, maybe not quite that way. But anyway, at least different colored papers. So I'm going to leave you all with one philosophical thought that really kind of made me think. Okay, God was the idea of this collective one, essentially, and everything emanates from it, right? Okay, and it's all-knowing, it's omnipresent, it's everywhere, it's in everything, it's all this and that, it knows everything, it's whatever, right? Okay, that's God. Okay, I mean, you know, that really has, the concept of that hasn't really changed, right? To some degree. Okay, so even though we think, well, we're God now, whatever, you know, whatever. But anyway, that's still that concept, whether you put it out there or here, it's still kind of the same. So my thought on it is this, is that I got to looking at astrology and I thought, wait a minute, that concept of God is really just Aquarius, because the concept, Aquarius is really the concept of the collective humanity and everything. And so I'm like, really, God is just, you know, it's like this totally white thing that you can trace everything to, and everything emanates from it, and it's all a collective soul of humanity. And that's why, I mean, my gosh, that's what we've been listening to Don Parnell preaching for years, because, you know, that's, you know, okay, I mean, he's an Aquarian, so he thinks like that naturally, and it's the age of Aquarius and blah, 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 right? You know, okay, I mean, yeah, that's what it is. Okay, but, you know, he's just a great example because he's been saying that. So you should have some understanding of what I'm trying to compare it to. So anyway, which that's what it is. Okay, so anyway, but the thing about it is that concept of what, that the concept of what God is, and then Don Parnell teaches us about, the humanity, the concept of the one concept of humanity and Aquarius and this and that. Well, that sounds an awful lot like the concept of what God is. So for the longest time I thought, gee, it seems like to me that we're making Aquarius, the age of Aquarius, God. And not rightfully so, because, how can one astrology sign be God? It just didn't seem to make sense. Then I got to think about it, and I thought, well, no, I could do better than that. I'll go so far as to say that Aquarius actually is God. The concept of Aquarius actually is God, because the collective soul of humanity and the light that emanates from the source of the one really is the concept of Aquarius. So I would go so far as to say that actually, in terms of the zodiac, Aquarius literally is God, because what we were looking for was the concept of God to return, right? Okay, so anyway, God did return in terms of the age of Aquarius, literally, because the age of Aquarius literally is that concept of God. Okay, all right, but how does this work? How does this work? Because why is it that if we can say that Aquarius is God, literally, because it has all the characteristics of God, like everything that you're going through right now with the AI, intelligence, and getting the understanding and raising the understanding of everything, and having the central data centers and collectivization of intelligence, and it's like the cloud and everything, because Aquarius is the highest air sign in astrology. Okay. So it's the highest intelligence, it's everything. It represents, because what God's the highest intelligence, the total understanding of everything, blah, 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 right? That's to some degree. And so that was what it was proverbially was. So, so how do you, so it's literally Aquarius. That's why they're doing all this stuff. That's why they're building these data centers, building all this AI, this ultimate intelligence, the internet, all this stuff is coming all together because it's like the physical embodiment, the metaphysical embodiment of Aquarius and God and the whole concept, because it's you know what I mean. It's the of the omnipresence and the all-knowing aspects of what the concept of God was. Through AI, through all these things. Okay. So yes, okay, so that happens in the age of Aquarius. Well, yeah, that makes sense. It's when we start doing it, okay, all right. So my question is this: if Aquarius is the concept of God, literally embodied in an astrology sign, an astrology age, then I thought God created astrology. I thought that what is God doing here as 1/12 of all the zodiac signs? Because I thought God was, he was the one that created the zodiac, right? Isn't God supposed to be the Mazzaroth as opposed to just the one sign of Aquarius? What the heck is God doing here as only one sign of the zodiac? And here's what I think. I think we have taken God completely out of perspective for so long. I think that the concept of God is only 1/12 of the possibilities of what you could have. I think that rather than saying that this concept of the all-knowing everything, that's just Aquarius. That's just the most intelligent air sign is all that is. It's just one sign. Leo, for example, the equal opposite of Aquarius is total independence, right? Okay, it's the opposite of collective thinking and collective knowledge. It's independent. It's completely it wants to be independent all the time. It doesn't necessarily want to. Honestly, Leos put me into mind that they really don't want to communicate with anybody. I think they do, but they really don't want to. I think they'd rather be left alone. But anyway, sorry, Leos, but this, I'm sure you're probably going to say, hey, man, I'd really just rather be kind of like left to myself to do my own devices. So anyway, but they always put me in that mindset that they really don't want to talk to you. They'd rather be alone. But anyway, but they do talk to you. But anyway, So Leo's the opposite. Okay. But they're totally independent. Well, so are we going to say that Aquarius is God and Leo's just like, what's Leo then? The devil? I mean, this just don't really, are we going to say that one astrology sign is God and one astrology sign is the devil because Aquarius embodies the whole concept of God, so it must be God essentially. And then Leo is the devil. I think it's kind of more like what we concluded back in the day was that God and the devil are brothers, really. And we need to not look at God as though it's the ultimate, the end-all, be-all, even though it kind of is. It's just the concept of the end-all, be-all. But the concept of the end-all, be-all is not the only concept. Let your mind go higher. The concept of everything is not everything. Aquarius is not only one of 12 possible outcomes in the astrology, and it is the concept of everything. But it's not everything. The concept of everything is not everything. And it's like when you look in a dictionary. Everything is not the only word in the dictionary, you see? If the way we looked at God all these years were true, then there would only be one word in the dictionary, and it would be everything. But God is only part of everything, you see. God is not everything. He's only part of everything, but it is the word everything. You see what I'm saying? I've been trying to say this for forever, and I could never get it out. But that's why I said that the way everybody's looking at this stuff is just not right. You can't look at the age. They looked at the age of Aquarius. I've seen a lot of people do this, especially when it started, all this stuff started. And they were looking at it like, this is all there is, and it's just like, we're going to go around like floating on a cloud, and and it's just we're in this mindset of well, we found everything now, and I'm like, yeah, cool, I agree, but everything ain't everything. I'll give you another example. I'll give you a good example. I think whenever Moses and God were up on the mountain and they're having this Moses and God, whatever. And they're up on the mountain, and they're having this conversation. And, it's like the Israelites, I think they had made the golden calf, and Moses comes back. I don't know. I can't remember. Anyway, and God's like, I'm going to kill them all off, because they did this, and they screwed up. And, now they're like unholy because they did this or whatever. Something, they're unholy, whole, because God's whole, right? It's the whole collectivization of everything, because whatever, that's Aquarius, it's whole. It's all one thing. It all comes from one source. And so anyway, Moses is up there, and he's having a conversation with God, and he's like, God's like, they're unwhole now, and I got to do this or that, and Moses is like, nah. If we do that, then this is going to happen, and this is going to be bad, and then everybody's going to think, well, this was all just didn't work out, and your name's going to be slandered and this and that, whatever, and nobody's going to believe it anymore. And we come out of Egypt, but they're going to be like, but it was just a farce, So you can't just kill them all off, and so God's like, well, yeah, I guess you're right, Moses. I guess we'll just kill them all off in 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, So we'll get rid of this generation that way because they're unholy, and then we'll start with another holy, something like that, That's probably the idea. So anyway, it's like, okay, well, that sounds pretty good. So, but the question always was not the conversation. The question was, how the heck did Moses have a better idea than God did? That was always the question for anybody who was a philosophical thinker and not just a religious Bible reader, was how did Moses have a better idea than God did? I thought God was the ultimate authority here. Here's your answer. The answer is that God is only 1/12 of all possibilities. So Moses he probably represented, I'm not sure, he could have represented Capricorn, because usually Capricorn is represented by the prophet sage, the wise prophet sage on the mountain, because it's a mountain goat and it's the wisest sign. It could have been that. It could have been, I mean, I don't know. I'm just speculating. But it was one sign. It was certainly Moses because Aaron represented Libra, because he was the Levite priest. So Libra is the Levites, okay? So Aaron's down there, and what does he do? Libras try to balance everything, and they try to they hate to make people mad. They try to keep everybody happy, that sort of thing. So whenever they come and brought him all the gold to make the golden calf, he's like, okay, here's your golden calf, because he's a Libra. He didn't want to offend anybody. He just made him a golden calf. But he was really blameless because he just did what they wanted to do. It wasn't his fault. That's a Libra. They don't really have anything. They're kind of like indecisive, and they don't really have a which way, one way or the other. That's the whole point of being a Libra. That's the whole point of being a priest. It's an intercessor. You have to be that way to do it. So, they're again playing their part. And so anyway, Aaron represented the Libra in that situation. God probably represented Aquarius, and Moses might have represented, I think, Capricorn. So it was probably just Capricorn and Aquarius literally having a conversation on the mountain. And I don't know if it was, God even could have been maybe Leo. That's a possibility too. I don't know, but the point I'm trying to get here is, I tend to think it was probably Aquarius, but the point I'm trying to get to here is that God is not everything. God is just one part of everything. And you've got all these things working together, and we need to get off of this idea that God is everything. God ain't everything. God is everything, but everything ain't the only word in the dictionary. Okay, Aquarius is everything, but it ain't the only astrology sign. And that's that explains how that Moses had a different idea. I wouldn't say better necessarily, but at least a different idea that may even made God think, because it's like, God changed his mind. So how did Moses, a mere man, change? Because he wasn't a mere man. He was representative of an astrology sign of some sort that was equal to God. God isn't just a part. He's just an astrology sign. He's just Aquarius or whatever. And anybody that's having a conversation with him is just another astrology sign. He's on equal footing with God, essentially. God's just on equal footing with man, essentially, or with whatever else, the astrology signs, whatever it represented, He's just on equal footing, essentially. And, of course, I know, that's going to open up a can of worms, isn't it? The idea that God's on equal footing with man. Well, yeah, but man could be like an astrology sign in this regard, not necessarily man. Because you kind of get into you really open up a can of worms when you get into that, and rightfully so. God on equal footing with man, but in terms of astrology signs, it was at least God was just equal with another astrology sign. He wasn't like better than all the rest. Like I said, the Mazzaroth, I thought God should have created the astrology, but here you find the concept of God in astrology. It's one of the 12 signs. What's going on here? So anyway, and then you could say, well, maybe the Mazzaroth's God, and then Aquarius is like the astrology sign of God put into. It's like, oh God, let's just not go there. Let's not create another God here. I mean, we may have to, but for today, maybe let's not. So anyway, let's not say, oh well, we need to start worshiping the Mazzaroth now or something. If we're going to worship something like that. Let's just, maybe the whole point is we need to realize we need to just stop worshiping stuff. Except for something that needs worshiped, perhaps. Maybe there is something like Leo's the sun. Well, the sun is traditionally worshipped. Well, maybe we really should worship Leo to some degree. You know what I'm saying? I mean, maybe it's like when the sun comes out, everybody kind of worships the sun because it's without even thinking about it, So, and when a Leo walks into a room and they're talking to you, maybe everybody else in the room is actually kind of worshiping them without even realizing it. I think about all this stuff. I'm like, what's going on here? So anyway, it's just natural positions. Like I said, it all comes down to it is written. It was written, and then that's just what it is, and we got to play the parts. So anyway, the back half of this has just been philosophy. It's just philosophy with Brother Cook, and I'm done now. Okay, so anyway, see y'all later. Hope you enjoyed and get some provoking thoughts, if nothing else. And of course, I hope you believe everything that I said and say I'm the greatest guy ever and I know everything, right? Yeah, okay. All right, see y'all later.